A cryptic advertisement in the village gazette lures the curious to Blackthorn Manor, promising a party with surprises, but what begins as a night of champagne and secrets turns deadly. When a guest vanishes, a scream echoes, and a body is found. Where the roses mysteriously fade, Miss Marple unravels a web of greed, betrayal, and murder. Who wrote the note that led to death? Why was the garden poisoned? And what secret, buried in a locket, drove a killer to strike? Step into a world of whispered conspiracies and hidden wills, where every smile hides a motive, and only Miss Marple's keen eye can reveal the truth. Chapter 1. The curious advertisement. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage. She sat in her favourite armchair, a delicate china teacup balanced on its saucer, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl. The village was quiet, save for the distant hum of bees and the occasional chatter of sparrows. Miss Marple's sharp eyes, however, were not on her stitches, but on the world beyond her window, where life's subtler patterns often revealed themselves. The tranquility shattered when the front door burst open, admitting Mrs. Agnes Price, her neighbour, in a flurry of lavender skirts and breathless excitement. "Oh, Miss Marple, you must see this," she exclaimed, thrusting the chipping gazette into the air as if it were a royal decree. Her round face, flushed from her brisk walk, beamed with the thrill of gossip. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her curiosity piqued. "My dear Agnes, whatever is the matter?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with that gentle probing tone that coaxed secrets from even the most guarded souls. "It's this advertisement." Mrs. Price plopped into a chair, fanning herself with a newspaper. "In the Gazette, of all places. It's positively bizarre." She smoothed the paper on the tea table and pointed to a small, neatly printed notice in the personals column. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and leaned forward, reading aloud in her soft, measured tone. "A party is to be held at Blackthorn Manor. Friday, 6:30 p.m. All are welcome. Expect surprises." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. "How very peculiar," she murmured. "No host named, no RSVP requested, and expect surprises. That's rather theatrical, don't you think?" "Theatrical?" Mrs. Price echoed, her eyes wide. "It's downright mysterious. Blackthorn Manor hasn't hosted a party since Lady Beatrice Harrow inherited it 5 years ago. She's practically a recluse, that one. Why, I saw her in the village shop last month, all stiff and haughty, buying nothing but tin sardines and a loaf of bread. And now this." Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Perhaps Lady Beatrice is feeling sociable at last," she said, though her tone suggested she thought otherwise. "Or perhaps someone else placed the advertisement. The Gazette isn't known for verifying its notices." Mrs. Price gasped. "You think it's a prank? Oh, Jane, you must come with me to the manor tomorrow evening. Half the village is talking about it already. Mr. Pye from the bakery, the vicar's wife, even young Tom from the post office. They're all going." Miss Marple considered this, her fingers absently tracing the edge of her teacup. She had a knack for noticing what others overlooked, the flicker of unease in a smile, the pause before a lie. An anonymous invitation to a grand manor, promising surprises, was precisely the sort of puzzle that stirred her quiet but relentless curiosity. "Very well, Agnes," she said at last. "I shall attend." One mustn't ignore an invitation so generously extended. The following evening, Miss Marple stood before Blackthorn Manor, her sensible coat buttoned against the autumn chill. The manor loomed at the edge of chipping Cleghorn, its ivy-clad walls and tall chimneys casting an imposing silhouette against the twilight sky. The gravel drive crunched underfoot as she and Mrs. Price joined a stream of villagers, their faces alight with curiosity and apprehension. Lamps flickered along the path, guiding them to the manor's heavy oak doors, which stood ajar, spilling golden light onto the stone steps. Inside, the grand hall was a vision of faded opulence. Crystal chandeliers gleamed overhead, their light catching the polished mahogany of the staircase. A long table held silver trays of Connapp's tiny quiches, smoked salmon on toast points, and glistening fruit tarts. Servants in crisp uniforms moved silently, offering champagne to the eclectic crowd, villagers in their Sunday best, a few strangers in city attire, and, presiding over it all, Lady Beatrice Harrow. Lady Beatrice, tall and angular, stood near. The fireplace, her silver hair swept into a severe chignon, her emerald green dress shimmered, but her expression was as cold as the marble floor. She greeted guests with a nod, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for something or someone. Miss Marple, clutching her embroidered handbag, observed her closely. There was a tightness in Lady Beatrice's posture, a faint tremor in her fingers as she lifted her glass. Nervous, Miss Marple thought, but why? Mrs. Price tugged at her sleeve. Look, there's Mr. Clarence, the solicitor from London. He's been staying at the Blue Boar Inn for a week, you know. And that woman in the red dress, Miss Violet, they call her. She arrived yesterday, all glamour and mystery. Nobody knows. Who invited her? Miss Marple's gaze followed Mrs. Price's pointing finger. Mr. Clarence, a wiry man with a pinched face, hovered near the punch bowl, his eyes darting nervously. Miss Violet, by contrast, was a vision of confidence, her auburn hair cascading over a scarlet gown that drew every eye. She laughed loudly at something Dr. Ellis, the village physician, said, though his scowl suggested he found her less amusing. An interesting mix, Miss Marple murmured, her mind cataloguing each face, each gesture. She noted young Tom, the post-office lad, lingering near a servant girl who seemed flustered, her tray of glasses wobbling. The room buzzed with chatter, but an undercurrent of unease rippled through it. The invitation's promise of surprises hung over them like a storm cloud. As the grandfather clock in the hall struck 6:30, the chandeliers flickered, dimming for a heartbeat before blazing back to life. A sharp, piercing scream cut through, the noise freezing the room. It came from the direction of the library, a heavy door at the far end of the hall. The guests turned, glasses clinking, voices rising in alarm. Lady Beatrice's face paled, her hand gripping the mantel. Good heavens! Mrs. Price clutched Miss Marple's arm. What was that? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Let us find out, she said, moving toward the library with a briskness that belied her age. The crowd parted, some following, others hesitating. Lady Beatrice hurried forward, her voice sharp. There's no need for alarm. It was likely just a servant dropping a tray. But Miss Marple, undeterred, reached the library door. It was locked, the brass handle cold under her touch. She turned to the nearest servant, a young girl with wide eyes and trembling hands. My dear, do you know who screamed? Miss Marple asked gently. The girl, whose name tag read Elsie, swallowed hard. I was passing the library, ma'am, when I saw someone a shadow really slip inside. I thought it was odd, so I looked through the keyhole, and then I screamed. I didn't mean to. A shadow. Miss Marple prompted, her tone soothing but firm. "Can you describe it?" Elsie shook her head. "It was quick, ma'am. Tall, maybe, and wearing dark clothes. I couldn't see a face. The door was open for a moment, then it shut, and I heard the lock click." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. A locked library, a shadowy figure, and a scream at precisely 6:30 at the time of the advertised surprises. She glanced at Lady Beatrice, who was now directing servants to calm the guests. The lady's composure had returned, but her eyes lingered on the library door. "Perhaps we should open it," Miss Marple suggested, her voice carrying just enough authority to draw attention. The crowd murmured, and Lady Beatrice hesitated before producing a key from her pocket. "Very well," she said, her tone clipped. "But I assure you, it's nothing serious." The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room lined with bookshelves. A mahogany desk stood at the center, its surface bare save for a single candelabrum, its flames casting eerie shadows. The air smelled of old leather and wax. Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. The windows were latched, the curtains undisturbed. No one was there. Mrs. Price peered over her shoulder. "Well, that's odd. Where's the shadowy figure?" Miss Marple's gaze fell on the desk. A faint smudge marked its edged charcoal. Perhaps, or soot. She bent closer, her fingers brushing the wood. "Someone was here," she said softly, "and recently." Lady Beatrice frowned. "Nonsense. The library is always locked." Elsie must have imagined it. But Miss Marple's attention shifted to the floor, where a single thread, dark blue, almost black, lay near the desk. She tucked it into her handbag, unnoticed by the others. "Perhaps," she said, her tone mild, "but a scream is rarely without cause." As the guests were ushered back to the hall, Miss Marple lingered, her mind piecing together the evenings. Fragments, the anonymous advertisement, the locked library, Elsie's shadowy figure, and Lady Beatrice's unassuming was a tapestry of secrets, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel it. For now, the scream's source was clear, Elsie's glimpse of an intruder. But who was it, and why had they slipped into the library at the stroke of 6:30? She rejoined Mrs. Price, who was already whispering theories to the vicar's wife. "Jane, do you think it's a ghost? They say Blackthorn Manor is haunted." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ghosts don't leave threads, Agnes, nor do they lock doors behind them." As the party resumed, the music swelling and glasses clinking, Miss Marple's eyes remained sharp, watching the guests. The evening had only begun, and the promise of surprises felt more ominous than ever. Chapter 2. The locked library, the grand hall of Blackthorn Manor, hummed with renewed chatter. The earlier scream now a topic of fevered speculation among the guests. Crystal glasses clinked, and the strains of a string quartet drifted through the air, but Miss Jane Marple stood apart, her eyes fixed on the heavy library door. The memory of Elsie's trembling voice and the dark thread in her handbag tugged at her thoughts like an unfinished stitch. The party might have resumed, but the mystery had only deepened. Mrs. Price, her cheeks flushed with champagne, sidled up to Miss Marple. "Jane, you're not still thinking about that scream, are you? It was just a silly maid, startled by shadows. Come, have a tart there, divine." She gestured toward the silver trays, where guests nibbled on delicacies. Miss Marple smiled, faintly. "In a moment, Agnes. I find myself curious about that library. A locked room is often a keeper of secrets, don't you think?" Mrs. Price blinked, her enthusiasm dimming. "Secrets? Oh, you do see mysteries everywhere. Well, If you must poke about, I'll stay here with the lemon curd." She bustled off, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. The library door, now closed, again seemed to beckon. Miss Marple glanced at Lady Beatrice Harrow, who stood near the quartet, her emerald dress catching the light. Her composure had returned, but her eyes flicked toward the library too often for it to be casual. She's guarding something, Miss Marple thought, or someone. Approaching the door, Miss Marple noticed young Tom, the post office lad, lingering nearby. His freckled face was earnest, but his hands fidgeted with the hem of his jacket. He had been hovering near the servants earlier, and Miss Marple suspected he knew more than he let on. "Tom," she said softly, her voice warm but probing, "you've a keen eye for the goings-on in the village. Did you see anyone near the library before Elsie screamed?" Tom flushed, his ears reddening. "Well, ma'am, I wasn't spying, mind you, but I did see someone, a tall fellow. Dark coat slip round the corner of the hall just before the lights flickered. I thought he was a guest, but he moved, ... sneaky-like, sneaky-like." Miss Marple repeated, her tone encouraging. "And where did he go?" "Toward the library, I reckon. But the door was locked when I passed by after. I didn't think much of it till Elsie screamed." He glanced nervously at Lady Beatrice, who was now speaking with Mr. Clarence, the solicitor. Miss Marple patted his arm. "You've been most helpful, Tom. Now, might you know where the spare keys to the library are kept? I'd like to take a closer look." Tom hesitated, then leaned in, his voice a whisper. "The housekeeper, Mrs. Gibbs, keeps them in the pantry, ma'am. But she's fierce about it. You'd need a distraction." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Leave that to me." She glanced at the crowd, spotting Mrs. Price laughing loudly near the punch bowl. A plan formed. She approached her friend and murmured, "Agnes, dear, could you ask Mrs. Gibbs about her recipe for those tarts? Keep her occupied for a moment." Mrs. Price, delighted by the task, bustled off to the pantry, her voice already rising in culinary enthusiasm. Miss Marple nodded to Tom, who darted off and returned minutes later, a brass key glinting in his hand. "Be quick, ma'am," he whispered, pressing it into her palm. "Mrs. Gibbs'll have my hide if she knows." The library door yielded with a soft click, and Miss Marple slipped inside, closing it behind her. The room was dim, lit only by the candelabrum on the desk, its flames casting long shadows across the bookshelves. The air was heavy with the scent of aged paper and polish. She moved to the desk, her steps silent on the thick rug. The smudge she'd noticed earlier charcoal, she was certain now marked the desk's edge. Her fingers brushed it, leaving a faint black residue on her glove. Her gaze fell on a single sheet of paper, tucked beneath a leather blotter. She lifted it carefully, revealing elegant, slanted handwriting. "The truth lies where the roses fade." The words sent a shiver through her. Cryptic messages were rarely innocent, and this one suggested a deeper game at play. She slipped the note into her handbag beside the dark thread, and scanned the room for further clues. The bookshelves were meticulously arranged, but one section caught her Ajar row of botanical volumes, their spines worn from use. She reached for a book titled The Language of Flowers, but as she pulled it, a soft click sounded, and a small panel in the shelf swung open. Inside was a velvet-lined compartment, empty save for a faint indentation, as if something's key or locket had rested there. Recently removed, she thought, her mind racing. Footsteps approached the door, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. She replaced the book, closed the panel, and stepped back just as the door swung open. Lady Beatrice stood there, her face a mask of controlled surprise. "Miss Marple, what are you doing here? The library is private." Miss Marple turned, her expression serene. "Forgive me, Lady Beatrice. I was curious about the scream earlier. Elsie mentioned a shadowy figure, and I thought perhaps something was left behind." She gestured vaguely at the desk. Watching the other woman's reaction, Lady Beatrice's eyes flicked to the desk, then back to Miss Marple. "There's nothing here." The girl was mistaken. Her voice was sharp, but her hand, clutching the doorframe, trembled slightly. Miss Marple's gaze dropped to her sleeve, where a faint, dark staining, perhaps, or something more sinister marred the emerald fabric. "Of course," Miss Marple said mildly. "Though it's curious, isn't it? A locked room, a scream, and yet no trace of an intruder." She paused, letting the words hang. "Unless they left something behind." Lady Beatrice's lips tightened. "I must ask you to return to the party. The library is no place for ... speculation." She ushered Miss Marple out, locking the door behind them, back in the hall. The party had taken on a feverish energy, as if the guests were determined to outshine the earlier unease. Miss Violet, in her scarlet gown, was now dancing with Dr. Ellis, though his stiff posture suggested reluctance. Mr. Clarence stood alone, his fingers twisting a napkin into knots. Miss Marple watched him closely, recalling the note's handwriting. It had a distinctive flourish, a looping T that matched the signature she'd seen on a letter he'd dropped earlier by the punch bowl. She approached him, her demeanor disarming. "Mr. Clarence, you seem unsettled. Is the party not to your liking?" The solicitor started, his glasses slipping down his nose. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's quite lively, isn't it? I'm not much for crowds." His voice was high, nervous, and his eyes darted to the library door. "I imagine you're more at home with documents than dancers," she said, her tone light. "You must see many interesting papers in your work. Letters, perhaps, with unique handwriting." His face paled, and he stammered, I suppose so. Nothing out of the ordinary." But his fingers shredded the napkin, betraying his unease. Miss Marple nodded, her suspicion confirmed. The note's handwriting was his, she was certain of it. But why had he written it, and what did it mean? The truth lies where the roses fade. The manor's rose garden, visible through the hall's tall windows, glowed under the moonlight, its blooms vibrant. Yet the note suggested decay, a hidden truth. She filed the thought away, knowing the party held more secrets. Yet as she rejoined Mrs. Price, who was now regaling the vicar's wife with tales of Mrs. Gibbs's tart recipe, Miss Marple's mind churned. The locked library, the cryptic note, Lady Beatrice's stained sleeve, and Mr. Clarence's nervous demeanour wove a pattern she couldn't yet fully discern. But the note was a tangible clue, and its author, Mr. Clarence, was a thread to follow. "Jane, you look positively absorbed," Mrs. Price exclaimed. "Did you find anything in that stuffy old library?" "Only a sense of curiosity, Agnes," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling. "But sometimes that's enough." The quartet struck up a new tune, and the guests swirled around her, their laughter masking the tension that lingered. Miss Marple sipped her tea brought by a thoughtful servant hand, watched Mr. Clarence slip toward the garden doors, his movements furtive. The evening was far from over, and the library's secrets were only the beginning. Chapter 3. The Vanishing Guest. The Grand Hall of Blackthorn. Manor buzzed with the forced gaiety of a party teetering on the edge of unease. The string quartet played a lively waltz, but the guests' smiles were taut, their glances darting toward the library door where a scream had erupted earlier. Miss Jane Marple stood near a towering fern, her embroidered handbag clutched lightly, her eyes scanning the crowd. The cryptic note she'd found in the library, "The truth lies where the roses fade," weighed on her mind, as did Mr. Clarence's nervous demeanour and Lady Beatrice's stained sleeve. The evening, with its promise of surprises, felt increasingly like a stage for something sinister. Mrs. Price, ever the social butterfly, fluttered back to Miss Marple's side, her lavender skirts swishing. "Jane, you're missing all the fun. Miss Violet is teaching Dr. Ellis to dance, and he's as stiff as a poker. Oh, and have you seen that odd man, Mr. Reed? He was here earlier, in a grey suit, but I can't find him now." Miss Marple's ears pricked at the name. "Mr. Reed?" she asked, her voice mild but alert. "Describe him, Agnes." "Tall, dark hair, a bit aloof," Mrs. Price said, fanning herself. "He was chatting with Miss Violet by the fireplace, but then he wandered off. His coat's still on the rack, but he's vanished." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the coat rack near the Manor's entrance, where a grey overcoat hung among the others. She recalled a tall figure in a dark coat, mentioned by young Tom in the previous hour, slipping toward the library before Elsie's scream. Could it have been Mr. Reed? And if so, where was he now? "Curious," she murmured, moving toward the coat rack. The grey coat was finely tailored, its pockets empty save for a crumpled train ticket from London, dated that morning. The name J. Reed was scrawled on it in a hurried hand. She tucked the ticket back, her mind turning to the rose garden visible through the hall's tall windows. The note's mention of fading roses nagged at her, a clue that felt more urgent with each passing moment. The quartet paused, and Lady Beatrice announced a parlour game to lighten the mood. "A treasure hunt," she declared, her voice bright but strained. "Hidden tokens are scattered about the hall. Find one, and you'll win a prize." The guests, eager for distraction, dispersed, rummaging under cushions and behind curtains. Miss Marple, however, saw her chance. While the crowd was occupied, she slipped toward a side door leading to the garden, determined to investigate. The rose garden was a maze of moonlit blooms, their petals glowing red and white against the dark foliage. The air was heavy with their scent, undercut by a faint, acrid note Miss Marple couldn't place. She moved carefully along the gravel path, her sensible shoes crunching softly. The garden was silent, save for the distant hum of the party. She paused by a cluster of roses, their petals drooping slightly, as if touched by an early frost-thaw. Something less natural. Kneeling, she examined the soil, her fingers brushing the earth. It was dry, almost powdery, unlike the well-tended beds she'd expected. Her eyes caught a glint of fabric snagged on a Thorner monogrammed handkerchief, embroidered with J.R. in bold blue thread. "Mr. Reed," she thought, her pulse quickening. She tucked the handkerchief into her handbag, beside the note and the dark thread from the library. The clue was clear. Mr. Reed had been here, in the rose garden, before he vanished. A rustle in the bushes made her freeze. She straightened, her knitting needles clutched like a talisman. "Who's there?" She called softly, her voice steady. Despite the darkness, no answer came, but a shadow shifted among the roses, then vanished toward the Manor's rear. Miss Marple considered following, but thought better of it. The garden was vast, and she was alone. Instead, she turned back to the path, her mind piecing together the puzzle. The note's words, "Where the roses fade," pointed to this very spot. And now Mr. Reed's handkerchief confirmed his presence. But why had he come here, And where was he now? Returning to the hall, Miss Marple found the treasure hunt in full swing. Guests laughed as they uncovered trinkets, brooches, bookmarks, and tiny silver charms. Lady Beatrice presided over the chaos, her smile fixed, but her eyes followed Miss Marple as she re-entered. She knows I was outside, Miss Marple thought. Noting the faint tightening of Lady Beatrice's jaw, she approached Elsie, the maid who had screamed earlier, now serving tea to the vicar's wife. "Elsie, dear," Miss Marple said gently, "did you see Mr. Reed, the tall man in the grey suit, near the garden earlier?" Elsie's eyes widened, her tray wobbling. "Oh, ma'am, I did. Just before the scream, I saw him by the garden door, looking all furtive. He was holding something, looked like a letter, maybe. Then he stepped outside, and I didn't see him after." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicion growing. "Thank you, Elsie. You've a good memory. A letter, a garden, a disappearance fragment fit into the pattern." Though the full picture remained elusive, she turned her attention to the guests seeking Mr. Clarence, whose handwriting matched the library note. He was near the fireplace, sipping brandy, his face pale. Miss Marple approached, her demeanour disarming. "Mr. Clarence, you seem out of sorts. Is the treasure hunt not to your liking?" He flinched, nearly spilling his drink. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's a bit much, all this excitement. I prefer quieter evenings." His eyes darted to the garden doors, then back to her. "Indeed," she said, her tone light, "though I imagine you've seen your share of excitement, handling important documents, perhaps even letters about roses." His hand shook and the brandy sloshed. "Our roses? I don't know what you mean," but his voice cracked, and he excused himself, hurrying toward the buffet. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind racing. Mr. Clarence's unease, Mr. Reed's disappearance, and the handkerchief in the rose garden were threads in the same tapestry. She glanced at Miss Violet, now laughing with a group of villagers. Her scarlet gown a vivid contrast to Dr. Ellis's dour expression beside her. Had Violet known Red well, as Mrs. Price suggested? And what of Dr. Ellis, whose scowl hinted at secrets of his own? The treasure hunt ended with cheers as a young girl found the final Tokina silver locket behind a portrait. Lady Beatrice clapped, her smile brittle. "Well done. Now, let's gather for supper. The dining room awaits." The guests moved toward the adjacent room, but Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the garden doors. She approached Tom, who was helping clear glasses. "Tom, did you see Mr. Reed after he went to the garden?" she asked quietly. Tom shook his head. "No, ma'am. I was busy with the trays after the scream. But I heard Miss Violet arguing with him earlier, by the fireplace. Something about promises and debts sounded heated." Miss Marple nodded, filing this away. An argument, a letter, a handkerchief, each clue tightened the knot of the mystery. She rejoined Mrs. Price, who was chattering about the locket's intricate design. "Jane, wasn't that game thrilling? Though I swear I saw Mr. Reed earlier, and now he's nowhere." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful. "People do have a way of slipping away." But her mind was on the handkerchief, its monogram a tangible link to the vanished guest. Mr. Reed had been in the rose garden, where the roses were inexplicably fading, just as the note foretold. His absence was no coincidence, and Miss Marple felt the weight of the evening's secrets pressing closer as the guests filed into the dining room, the scent of roast lamb and rosemary drifting through the air. Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned the crowd. Lady Beatrice's stained sleeve, Mr. Clarence's nervous glances, Miss Violet's easy charm, and Dr. Ellis's grim silence all were pieces of a puzzle she was determined to solve. For now, the handkerchief was proof that Mr. Reed had followed. The note's clue, but his fate remained a shadow in the night. "Jane, you're miles away," Mrs. Price said, nudging her. "Come, the supper looks splendid." Miss Marple smiled. "In a moment, Agnes. I'm just admiring the roses." Her gaze lingered on the garden, where the moonlight cast eerie shadows. The truth, she knew, was out there, where the roses faded, and she would find it. Chapter 4. The Poisoned Chalice. The dining room of Blackthorn Manor glowed with the soft flicker of candelabras, their light dancing across the polished oak table, laden with silver tureens and platters of roast lamb, glazed carrots and herb, potatoes. The guests, still buzzing from the treasure hunt, settled into their seats, their chatter a fragile veneer over the evening's mounting unease. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the head of the table, observed the scene with her usual quiet acuity. The disappearance of Mr. Reed, the cryptic note about fading roses, and the nervous demeanour of Mr. Clarence wove a pattern in her mind, one that grew more intricate with each passing moment. Mrs. Price, to her left, was in high spirits, her lavender dress rustling as she reached for a roll. "Jane, isn't this splendid? Such a feast. Though I do wonder where that Mr. Reed got to. It's not like him to miss supper, from what I've heard." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "People have their reasons for slipping away, Agnes. Sometimes they're drawn by secrets." Her eyes flicked to the empty chair where Mr. Reed should have been, its absence a silent accusation. Across the table, Lady Beatrice Harrow presided with regal poise, her emerald dress catching the candlelight, but her fingers toyed with her napkin, betraying a flicker of disquiet. The meal began, and servants glided silently, pouring ruby wine into crystal goblets. Miss Marple, who preferred tea, watched as Dr. Ellis, the village physician, raised his glass. His broad face, usually stern, was flushed, perhaps from the earlier dance with Miss Violet or something deeper. She had noted their earlier exchange sharp words near the fireplace, Miss Violet's laughter edged with mockery. Now Dr. Ellis sat opposite her, his scowl softened by the wine's allure, as the first course was served up. "Creamy mushroom soup, miss." Marple's attention shifted to the other guests. Mr. Clarence, 2 seats down, pushed his soup around with his spoon, his eyes darting to Lady Beatrice. Miss Violet, radiant in scarlet, chatted animatedly with a local farmer, her charm disarming but calculated. The air was thick with unspoken tensions, and Miss Marple felt the weight of the evening's mysteries pressing closer. A sudden, choking gasp shattered the hum of conversation. Dr. Ellis clutched his throat, his goblet clattering to the table, wine spilling like blood across the white cloth. His face contorted, eyes bulging, as he slumped forward, his chair scraping against the floor. The room erupted in chaos gasps, shouts, and the clatter of dropped cutlery. Miss Violet screamed, her hands flying to her mouth, while Mr. Clarence froze, his spoon mid-air. Miss Marple was on her feet in an instant, her calm demeanour a beacon amid the panic. "Quickly, someone fetch water," she called, moving to Dr. Ellis's side. She loosened his collar, noting his laboured breathing and the faint bluish tint to his lips. Poison, she thought, her mind racing. She caught a bitter, medicinal scent from the spilled wine, distinct from the fruity aroma of the others' glasses. Lady Beatrice stood, her voice sharp. "It's a medical episode, nothing more." Dr. Ellis has a weak heart, don't you, Doctor? She gestured to a servant. Help him to a chair in the drawing room. But Miss Marple's hand shot out, stopping the servant. Not yet, she said firmly, her tone cutting through the din. We must preserve the scene. This is no ordinary ailment. She bent closer, her gloved fingers brushing the goblet. The bitter scent was unmistakable digitalis. She suspected a heart medication that, in excess, could stop the heart entirely. Young Tom, the post office lad, appeared with a glass of water, his face pale. Miss Marple directed him to give it. To Dr. Ellis, who sipped weakly, his breathing steadying. The guests watched, hushed, as Miss Marple lifted the goblet, careful not to touch the rim. She wrapped it in her napkin and tucked it into her handbag. Ignoring Lady Beatrice's frown. Really, Miss Marple, Lady Beatrice said, her voice icy. This is hardly the time for theatrics. Dr. Ellis needs rest, not speculation. Miss Marple met her gaze, unruffled. A precaution, Lady Beatrice. Sudden illness at a party with such unusual circumstances warrants care. Her words were gentle but pointed, and Lady Beatrice's lips tightened. Dr. Ellis, revived but shaken, was helped to a sofa in the corner by Tom and a servant. Miss Marple followed, her eyes scanning his face. Dr. Ellis, can you recall anything unusual about your wine? She asked softly. He coughed, his voice hoarse. It tasted ... off, bitter, not like the others. I thought it was just a bad vintage. His eyes flicked to Miss Violet, then away, a shadow crossing his face. Miss Marple nodded, filing this away. She returned to the table, where the guests were whispering, their appetites gone. Mrs. Price clutched her arm. Jane, was it poison? Oh, this is dreadful. First a scream, then Mr. Reed vanishing, and now this. Calm yourself, Agnes, Miss Marple said, patting her hand. We shall get to the bottom of it. Her mind turned to the rose garden, where Mr. Reed's handkerchief had been found, and the note's cryptic warning. Digitalis, derived from foxgloves, was a poison that could lurk in a garden or a medicine cabinet. Dr. Ellis, as a physician, would have access to it. She approached the servant who had poured the wine, a young man named Peter, his face ashen. Peter, she said kindly, did you notice anything odd when you served Dr. Ellis's glass? Peter swallowed, glancing nervously at Lady Beatrice, who was now directing the servants to clear the table. I filled it from the same decanter as the others, ma'am. But I did see someone near the sideboard earlier, Miss Violet, I think. She was adjusting her shawl, but her hand was near the glasses. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Miss Violet, who had argued with both Mr. Reed and Dr. Ellis, was emerging as a figure of interest. She glanced at the woman in scarlet, now comforting a shaken guest, her expression one of perfect concern. Too perfect, Miss Marple thought. Determined to confirm her suspicion, Miss Marple excused herself to the powder room, where she examined the goblet under better light. The faint residue in the glass had a crystalline sheen, consistent with digitalis. She recalled Dr. Ellis's medical bag, glimpsed earlier near the coat rack. A quick detour to the hall confirmed her hunch. The bag was there, its clasp loose. Inside, she found a vial of digitalis tablets, half empty. The connection was clear, but was the poison meant for Dr. Ellis or someone else? Returning to the dining room, Miss Marple observed the guests. Mr. Clarence, his hands trembling, avoided her gaze. Miss Violet, now seated, sipped her own wine with studied calm. Lady Beatrice, directing the servants, seemed eager to move past the incident, but the question lingered. Who had tampered with the glass, and why? As the meal resumed, the mood subdued, Miss Marple leaned toward Mrs. Price. "Agnes, did you notice Dr. Ellis and Miss Violet earlier? Their conversation seemed ... heated." Mrs. Price's eyes widened. "Oh yes, by the fireplace, before the treasure hunt. She was teasing him about some old scandal, and he looked furious. Something about debts unpaid. Do you think it's related, perhaps?" Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. Debts, arguments, a missing guest, and now poison the threads were tightening. She glanced at Dr. Ellis, now sipping tea on the sofa, his colour returning. The poison had been a small dose, enough to shock but not kill. A warning, perhaps, or a mistake. The dinner concluded with a strained toast from Lady Beatrice, who urged the guests to enjoy the evening. But Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, piecing together the clues. The digitalis in Dr. Ellis's wine linked to his own medical bag, suggesting a personal motive. Had someone used his own medicine against him? Or had the glass been meant for another? As the guests rose, moving to the drawing-room for coffee, Miss Marple lingered, her handbag heavier with the wrapped goblet, the handkerchief, the note, the thread, and now the poison formed a pattern, one she was determined to unravel. For now, she had confirmed the wine's contents, a step toward the truth. "Jane, you're awfully quiet," Mrs. Price said, joining her. "Do you really think someone tried to poison poor Dr. Ellis?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think, Agnes, that this party holds more surprises than the invitation promised." Her eyes drifted to the rose garden beyond the windows, where the fading blooms whispered secrets yet to be uncovered. Chapter 5. Whispers in the dark. The drawing-room of Blackthorn Manor shimmered with the afterglow of dinner, the guests' voices mingling with the clink of coffee cups and the soft crackle of the fireplace. Yet the air held a taut edge, as if the poisoning of Dr. Ellis had cast a shadow no amount of candlelight could dispel. Miss Jane Marple sat in her backed chair near a velvet curtain, her embroidered handbag resting on her lap, its contents the cryptic note, the dark thread, Mr. Reed's handkerchief, and the poisoned goblets silently urging her to unravel. The evening's secrets, the note's words, the truth lies where the roses fade, echoed in her mind, intertwined with Mr. Reed's disappearance and the bitter scent of digitalis. Mrs. Price, ever buoyant, leaned toward her, balancing a saucer of petit fours. "Jane, you're missing the best part. The coffee is divine, and Miss Violet's telling stories about her London days. She's quite the charmer, though I don't trust that smile one bit." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Charm, Agnes, is often a mask for something deeper. I believe I'll take a turn about the room." She rose, her movements unhurried, but her gaze sharp as she scanned the guests. Dr. Ellis, recovered but subdued, sat near the hearth, sipping tea. Mr. Clarence, the solicitor, hovered by a bookcase, his fingers twitching as if longing for a pen. Miss Violet, her scarlet gown a beacon, held court among a cluster of villagers, her laughter bright but brittle. Lady Beatrice, ever the poised hostess, circulated with a silver tray, her emerald dress masking the tension Miss Marple had noted earlier. As the guests dispersed to admire the manor's portraits or refill their cups, Miss Marple drifted toward the hallway leading to the guest rooms. The corridor was dimly lit, its walls adorned with faded tapestries depicting pastoral scenes. She paused near a half-open door, catching the low, urgent tones of a conversation. Her knitting needles, tucked into her sleeve, were a comforting weight as she leaned closer, her ears attuned to the voices within. "You've ruined everything, Clarence," hissed a woman's voice, Miss Violet, unmistakable in its clipped, theatrical cadence. "If you'd kept your mouth shut, none of this would have happened." "I did what I had to," Mr. Clarence retorted, his voice trembling but defiant. "The deal was clear, Violet. You promised discretion, and now look, Reed's gone, and Ellis nearly died. Someone knows, and I'm not taking the blame." Miss Violet's laugh was sharp, like breaking glass. "Blame? Oh, you're in too deep to wriggle out now. If those papers come to light, we're both finished. Keep your nerve, or I'll make sure you regret it." Miss Marple's breath caught. Papers, the note in the library, penned in Mr. Clarence's hand, flashed in her mind. Was it part of this deal? And what did it have to do with Mr. Reed's disappearance or Dr. Ellis's poisoning? She stepped back, her shoes silent on the rug, as the door creaked open. Miss Violet emerged, her face composed but her eyes blazing. She swept past without noticing Miss Marple, who pressed herself against the tapestry. Mr. Clarence followed, his face ashen, and hurried toward the drawing-room. Miss Marple considered confronting him, but thought better of it. Knowledge was her weapon, and she needed more before showing her hand. The mention of the rose garden in the note tugged at her, urging her outside once more. A sudden blackout plunged the manor into darkness, the lamps snuffing out as if by a single breath. Gasps echoed from the drawing-room, followed by the shuffle of feet and nervous laughter. Miss Marple, undeterred, felt her way along the wall to the garden door she'd used earlier. The blackout was an opportunity, perhaps for her roar, for someone else. She slipped outside, the cool night air sharp against her skin. The rose garden lay under a silver moon, its blooms ghostly in the dim light. The acrid scent she'd noticed before was stronger now, mingling with the rose's sweetness. She moved carefully, her eyes scanning the shadows. The handkerchief she'd found earlier, marked with Mr. Reed's initials, had been snagged here, where the roses seemed to wilt unnaturally. Now a faint sound, soft, rhythmic, like scraping earth, drew her deeper into the garden. She paused by a cluster of drooping roses, their petals curling as if in retreat. Kneeling, she peered at the soil, her gloved hands brushing aside leaves. The ground was disturbed, freshly turned, as if someone had been digging. Her heart quickened as she heard footsteps, slight but deliberate, approaching from the far side of the garden. Gripping her knitting needles, she crouched behind a trellis, her breath steady despite the thrill of danger. A figure emerged, cloaked in darkness, moving with purpose. The moonlight caught a glint of metal, a trowel, perhaps, or something sharper. The figure knelt near the same rose bed, digging swiftly, the soil yielding with soft thuds. Miss Marple strained to see more, but the figure paused, as if sensing her presence, then bolted toward the manor's rear, vanishing into the shadows. She waited a moment, ensuring the figure was gone, then approached the spot. The soil was loose, and her fingers, cautious but determined, uncovered a small object wrapped in a cloth. She unwrapped it to reveal a silver locket, its surface engraved with the initials E.H. Inside, a faded photograph showed a young woman with striking features, her eyes hauntingly familiar. Lady Beatrice, Miss Marple thought, though the woman in the photo was younger, softer, her hair loose rather than pinned in the severe chignon of the present. She tucked the locket into her handbag, her mind racing. E.H. Edith Harrow. Lady Beatrice's given name? The locket, buried where the roses faded, was no coincidence. It tied to the note, to Mr. Reed's handkerchief, and perhaps to the secrets Miss Violet and Mr. Clarence whispered about. Had the figure been searching for this locket, or hiding it? And why here, in the poisoned soil of the rose garden? The manor's lights flickered back on, casting a warm glow through the windows. Miss Marple hurried back, slipping through the garden door as the guests' voices resumed their chatter. She re-entered the drawing-room, where Lady Beatrice was reassuring everyone that the blackout was a mere fault in the wiring. Her eyes met Miss Marple's, and for a moment a flicker of suspicion passed between them. Mrs. Price pounced on her. "Jane, where have you been?" "The lights went out, and I nearly spilled my coffee. Did you see anything odd?" "Only the beauty of the night," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "The garden is quite lovely by moonlight." But her mind was on the locket, its weight a new thread in the tapestry of secrets. She glanced at Miss Violet, now sipping coffee with a local magistrate, her charm unshaken. Mr. Clarence stood by the bookcase, his hands steadier now, but his eyes avoided hers. Dr. Ellis, still pale, was speaking quietly with Lady Beatrice, who nodded with forced calm. The overheard conversation, Miss Violet's accusation, Mr. Clarence's fear of papers, suggested a conspiracy, one that might explain Mr. Reed's absence and Dr. Ellis's near-fatal sip. Miss Marple settled back into her chair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she resumed her shawl. The locket's discovery was a breakthrough, linking Lady Beatrice to the rose garden's secrets. The initials E.H. and the photograph pointed to a personal connection, perhaps a past she wished to bury. For now, Miss Marple kept the locket hidden, knowing its revelation would shift the game. "Jane, you're awfully quiet," Mrs. Price said, nibbling a petit four. "What's got you so thoughtful?" Miss Marple smiled. "Just the patterns people weave, Agnes. They're often more telling than they realize." Her eyes drifted to the garden windows, where the roses stood silent, their fading petals a testament to the truth she was closing in on. Chapter 6. The body in the garden. The first light of dawn crept over Blackthorn Manor, painting the rose garden in hues of pink and gold. Inside, the guests had retired to their rooms after a night of strained revelry, but Miss Jane Marple had not slept. Her mind churned with the evening's clues. The scream in the library, the cryptic note, Mr. Reed's vanished handkerchief, Dr. Ellis's poisoned wine, and the locket buried where the roses faded. The weight of her handbag, now holding a small arsenal of evidence, anchored her resolve. She sat by her window in a guest room, her knitting needles idle, watching the garden where secrets seemed to take root. A sharp cry from outside shattered the morning's calm. Miss Marple rose, her shawl slipping to the floor, and hurried to the window. Below, a gardener, grizzled man named Mr. Burrows was stumbling back from the rose garden, his face ashen. "Help, there's a man dead," he shouted, his voice carrying through the manor's open windows. Miss Marple moved swiftly, her sensible shoes tapping down the staircase. She reached the garden door just as Lady Beatrice, in a silk dressing gown, emerged, her face pale but composed. "What is this nonsense, Burrows?" she demanded, though her voice trembled. "It's true, milady," Burrows stammered, pointing to the rose-bed. "He's there, by the white roses. Stabbed, he is." Miss Marple followed, her heart steady despite the grim news. The rose garden, so eerie by moonlight, was now a stark tableau under the morning sun. The guests, roused by the commotion, gathered at the edge, their whispers a low hum. Mrs. Price, clutching her robe, gasped as she joined Miss Marple. "Jane, is it true? A body? Oh, this is too dreadful." The body lay among the white roses, half hidden by their drooping petals. It was Mr. Reed, his grey suit stained dark with blood, a knife protruding from his chest. His face, frozen in a grimace, stared blankly at the sky. Miss Marple knelt, careful not to disturb the scene, and noted the wilted roses around him. Their petals, once vibrant, were curled and brown, as if scorched by an unseen flame. The acrid scent she'd detected before was stronger here, sharp. And Chemical Dot, Inspector Craddock, summoned from Chipping Cleghorn, arrived with a small team, his face grim. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "you've a knack for being where trouble is. What do you make of this?" She straightened, her expression serene but her eyes sharp. "A tragedy, Inspector, but not an accident. The roses here there, not wilting naturally. I suspect poison, perhaps herbicide, in the soil." She gestured to the brown petals, distinct from the healthy blooms nearby. Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Herbicide? That's a leap, even for you." But he signalled a constable to collect a soil sample, his respect for Miss Marple's instincts overriding his skepticism. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the body. The knife, a simple kitchen blade, was lodged deep, suggesting a sudden, violent act. She recalled the handkerchief she'd found here, marked with Mr. Reed's initials, and the locket with E.H. Lady Beatrice's initials. The note's words, "The truth lies where the roses fade," now felt prophetic. This spot, where Mr. Reed met his end, was the heart of the mystery. Lady Beatrice, standing at the garden's edge, clutched her gown. "This is appalling," she said, her voice tight. Mr. Reed was a guest, nothing more. Who would do such a thing? Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the faint tremor in her hands. "Indeed, Lady Beatrice, though it's curious that Mr. Reed was found where the roses are dying, almost as if he was drawn here." The guests murmured, their faces a mix of shock and suspicion. Miss Violet, her scarlet gown replaced by a sombre black dress, stood apart, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. Mr. Clarence, pale as ever, hovered near Dr. Ellis, who had recovered enough to join the crowd, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple recalled the overheard conversation, Miss Violet's accusation, Mr. Clarence's fear of papers, and wondered if Mr. Reed's death was tied to their secrets. She approached Mr. Burrows, who was now speaking with a constable. "Mr. Burrows," she said gently, "these roses, have you noticed anything unusual about them recently?" The gardener scratched his head, his eyes darting to Lady Beatrice. Mum, the white roses started wilting a few days ago, right sudden-like. I thought it was blight, but the soil smells queer, like chemicals. I told her ladyship, but she said to leave it be." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicion confirmed, and did. "You see anyone near this bed recently, besides Mr. Reed?" Burrows hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Last night, during that blackout, I saw a figure digging here. Couldn't make out who. Mind you, they scarpered when I came closer." Miss Marple's mind flashed to the shadowy figure she'd seen digging during the blackout, just before she found the locket. The pieces were aligning. The herbicide, the locket, Mr. Reed's death, all centered on this poisoned patch of earth. She thanked Burrows and moved to inspect the locket in her handbag, hidden from prying eyes. The photograph inside, of a younger Lady Beatrice, suggested a personal stake in the garden's secrets. Inspector Craddock approached, his notebook open. "Miss Marple, you're thinking something, I can tell." "Care to share?" She smiled faintly. "Only that the roses tell a story, Inspector. Someone poisoned them deliberately, perhaps to hide evidence or to mark a grave." She gestured to the soil, where the constable was bagging a sample. The analysis will tell us more, but I suspect herbicide, applied recently. Craddock frowned. You think the killer poisoned the roses to cover their tracks? Or to send a message? She said, her tone thoughtful. The note I found, "The truth lies where the roses fade," pointed to this very spot. Mr. Reed was here, and now he's dead. Craddock's eyes narrowed. A note? You didn't mention that. Miss Marple's expression was serene. I intended to, Inspector, once I understood its meaning. It's in Mr. Clarence's handwriting, I believe. She glanced at the solicitor, who was now speaking with Miss Violet, his gestures agitated. Craddock followed her gaze. Clarence, and Miss Violet, she knew Reed, didn't she? Quite well, it seems, Miss Marple said. They argued before he vanished, and Dr. Ellis, too, had his own quarrel with her. This garden holds more than roses, Inspector. As the constables cordoned off the scene, Miss Marple stepped back, her eyes lingering on the wilted blooms. She approached Elsie, the maid, who was watching from the garden's edge, her face pale. Elsie, dear, Miss Marple said, you mentioned Mr. Reed near the garden door last night. Did you see him with anyone? Elsie bit her lip. I saw him talking to Miss Violet, ma'am, just before he went outside. She looked angry, like she was scolding him. Then he slipped out, and I didn't see him again till ... This. Miss Marple nodded, filing this away. Miss Violet's connections to both Mr. Reed and Dr. Ellis, combined with her whispered threats to Mr. Clarence, made her a figure to watch. But the locket, with Lady Beatrice's initials, pointed to the hostess herself. Had she known Mr. Reed's fate awaited him here? Mrs. Price, hovering nearby, clutched Miss Marple's arm. Jane, this is ghastly. A murder right in the garden. Do you think it's connected to the poison in Dr. Ellis's wine? Everything is connected, Agnes, Miss Marple said softly, like threads in a tapestry. Each one leads to another. Craddock, overhearing, sighed. You're a step ahead, as usual. I'll question Miss Violet and Clarence, but I wish you'd share these clues sooner, Miss Marple. She smiled. In time, Inspector. Some truths need coaxing, like a shy bloom. Her gaze returned to the roses, their wilted petals a silent accusation. She approached Mr. Burrows again, who was now alone, tending a nearby bed. One last question, Mr. Burrows. Did you apply any chemicals to these roses recently? He shook his head firmly. No, ma'am. Her ladyship was particular, no sprays, no fertilizers, just water and pruning. That's why the wilting puzzled me. Miss Marple thanked him, her suspicion confirmed. The roses had been deliberately poisoned, likely with herbicide, to fulfill the note's prophecy. The soil sample would prove it, but for now, she had her answer. The fading roses were no accident, but a stage for murder. As the guests were ushered back inside, their faces pale with shock, Miss Marple lingered, her handbag heavy with clues. The locket, the handkerchief, the note, and the poisoned goblet formed a pattern, one that pointed to Lady Beatrice, Miss Violet, and Mr. Clarence. Mr. Reed's death was the culmination of the evening's secrets, but the why and how remained, just out of reach. Jane, you're awfully quiet, Mrs. Price said, joining her. What do you make of this horror? Miss Marple's eyes softened. That some gardens hide more than beauty, Agnes, but every secret leaves a trace. She glanced at the manor, where Lady Beatrice stood at the window, watching. The truth, Miss Marple knew, was closer than ever, buried where the roses faded. Chapter 7. The hidden Wilther morning sun hung low over Chipping Cleghorn, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the village archives. The events at Blackthorn Manor, the library scream, the cryptic note, Mr. Reed's handkerchief, Dr. Ellis's poisoning, the buried locket, and now Mr. Reed's body in the poisoned rose garden wove a complex tapestry in her mind. Her handbag, heavy with clues, was a silent companion, but the locket's initials, E.H. and a photograph resembling a younger lady, Beatrice, urged her to dig deeper into the manor's past. The note's promise, the truth lies where. The rose's fade had led to murder, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover why. The archives, housed in a quaint stone building beside the church, smelled of dust and old paper. Miss Marple greeted the librarian, Miss Hartnell, a wiry woman with a penchant for village history. "Good morning, Miss Hartnell," she said, her voice warm but purposeful. "I'm curious about Blackthorn Manor's records. Anything on the Harrow family, perhaps?" Miss Hartnell's eyes lit up, sensing a quest. "The Harrows? Oh, there's plenty, though it's a tangled tale. Let me fetch the ledgers." She bustled to a shelf, returning with a leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed but meticulously. Kept as Miss Marple pored over the records, her fingers tracing names and dates, a story emerged. Blackthorn Manor had passed to Lady Beatrice Harrow 5 years ago, after the mysterious disappearance of her younger sister, Eleanor Harrow. The ledger noted Eleanor's last known sighting in 1919, leaving the manor abruptly after a family dispute. No trace of her was found, and Beatrice inherited the estate. The initials E.H. on the locket clicked into place Eleanor Harrow, not Edith, as Miss Marple had assumed. The photograph, with its softer features, could be Eleanor, not Beatrice. Miss Marple's mind raced. Had Eleanor returned, or was her memory tied to Mr. Reed's death? The locket, buried where the roses faded, suggested a secret worth killing for. She thanked Miss Hartnell, her thoughts turning to Mr. Clarence, whose nervous handwriting matched the cryptic note. His whispered argument with Miss Violet about papers hinted at a document, perhaps a wilt that could unravel the mystery. Returning to Blackthorn Manor, Miss Marple found the atmosphere heavy with dread. The guests, confined until Inspector Craddock's investigation progressed, gathered in the morning room, their faces drawn. Mrs. Price, sipping tea, pounced on her. "Jane, where have you been? They're saying Mr. Reed was stabbed over some old grudge. Can you imagine?" "Grudges have deep roots, Agnes," Miss Marple said, her eyes scanning the room. Miss Violet, in a subdued grey dress, sat by a window, her charm muted. Dr. Ellis, recovered but grim, read a newspaper, his fingers tight on the pages. Mr. Clarence stood by a sideboard, his hands fidgeting with a pen. Miss Marple approached him, her demeanour disarming. "Mr. Clarence, a word, if I may. You seem troubled, and I wonder if it's more than this sad affair with Mr. Reed." He flinched, his glasses slipping. I'm fine, Miss Marple, just shaken, like everyone." But his voice cracked, and his eyes darted to the garden, where constables still combed the rosebed. She leaned closer, her tone gentle but firm. "You wrote that note in the library, didn't you, about the roses? And I heard you speak of papers with Miss Violet. Papers that might explain why Mr. Reed was drawn to that garden." Mr. Clarence's face drained of colour, his pen dropping to the floor. How did you know?" he whispered, glancing around. "Please, not here, somewhere private." Miss Marple nodded, leading him to a small parlour off the morning room, its walls lined with faded portraits. She closed the door, her knitting needles tucked into her sleeve for reassurance. "Speak freely, Mr. Clarence. Secrets kept too long can turn deadly." He sank into a chair, his hands trembling. "It was years ago," he began, his voice low. "I was Eleanor Harrow's solicitor. She came to me in 1919, desperate to change her will. She'd fallen out with Beatrice something about a man, a scandal. Eleanor left the manor to someone else, not Beatrice. I drafted the will, but she vanished before it was filed. I kept it locked in my office, thinking it was done with. Then Mr. Reed contacted me last month, claiming he had proof Eleanor was alive. He wanted the will." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And you wrote the note to warn him, or someone else?" Mr. Clarence shook his head. "I wrote it for myself, to remember where I'd hidden a copy in the rose garden, where Eleanor loved to sit. I didn't expect anyone to find it. But someone did, and now Reed's dead, and I'm afraid," his voice broke. A deafening crack split the air. A gunshot, sharp and close. Glass shattered in the parlour window, and Mr. Clarence gasped, clutching his arm as blood seeped through his sleeve. Miss Marple dropped to the floor, pulling him down as another shot rang out, embedding in the wall. Shouts erupted from the morning room, and footsteps pounded toward them. "Stay low," Miss Marple urged, her voice steady despite the chaos. She crawled to the window, peering through the broken pane. The garden was empty, but a glint of metal caught her eye near the rose-beater rifle, hastily discarded among the bushes. "Inspector." Craddock burst in, his face taut. "Miss Marple, are you hurt?" He knelt beside Mr. Clarence, who was pale but conscious, the wound shallow. "I'm fine, Inspector," she said, rising. "But Mr. Clarence needs a doctor, and you'll want to check the garden for that rifle." She pointed to the bushes, her mind already connecting the dots. Dr. Ellis, summoned from the morning room, bandaged Mr. Clarence's arm with brisk efficiency. "It's a graze," he said gruffly. "He'll live." But his eyes avoided Miss Marple's, and she noted the faint tremor in his hands as Craddock's men retrieved the rifle. Miss Marple slipped into the hall where Mrs. Price was wringing her hands. "Jane, a shooting. This manor is cursed. Who would do such a thing?" "Someone with a secret to protect," Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. She approached a constable holding the rifle, a hunting model with a polished stock. "Inspector, might you check the manor's gun room? I believe Dr. Ellis is a keen hunter." Craddock raised an eyebrow but nodded, sending a man to investigate. Moments later, the constable returned, confirming the rifle matched one registered to Dr. Ellis, kept in the manor's locked gun cabinet. Dr. Ellis, overhearing, flushed. "That's preposterous. I haven't touched that rifle in months." Miss Marple's gaze was serene. "Yet it was used today, Dr. Bryn. And not long after, Mr. Clarence spoke of a will that could append this manor's ownership." The guests, gathered in the hall, whispered furiously. Miss Violet's face was impassive, but her fingers twisted her shawl. Lady Beatrice, standing by the staircase, gripped the banister, her composure fraying. Mr. Clarence, now bandaged, sat heavily, his eyes haunted. Miss Marple turned to Craddock. "The will, Mr. Clarence mentioned it, disinherited Lady Beatrice. Mr. Reed's interest in it may have led to his death, and now someone wishes to silence Mr. Clarence." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "The rifle suggests a connection to Dr. Ellis, though whether he pulled the trigger remains to be seen." Craddock nodded, his notebook open. We'll question everyone, Miss Marple. But you've a way of seeing what we miss." He glanced at Dr. Ellis, who scowled but said nothing. Mrs. Price tugged at Miss Marple's sleeve. "Jane, a will. Is that what this is all about? Poor Mr. Clarence, shot for papers. Papers can be as deadly as knives." Agnes, Miss Marple said softly. Her mind turned to the locket, the note, the poisoned roses, and now the will. Eleanor Harrow's legacy was at the heart of this, and the rifle's link to Dr. Ellis tightened the knot. For now, the gunshot's source was clear, a weapon tied to the doctor, but the shooter's identity lingered in the shadows as the guests were ushered to their rooms under police watch. Miss Marple lingered in the hall, her handbag a repository of truths. The will, hidden by Mr. Clarence, was a motive for murder, and the rifle pointed to a new suspect. The roses, the locket, and the blood-stained garden were converging, and Miss Marple felt the truth drawing near. "Jane, you're too calm for all this," Mrs. Price exclaimed. "What's next? I dread to think." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The truth, Agnes, always finds its way, like sunlight through a storm." Her eyes drifted to the garden, where the roses stood silent, their secrets unraveling one shot at a time. Chapter 8. The masquerade unravels. The evening air at Blackthorn Manor was thick with tension, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Despite the grim events, Mr. Reed's murder, Dr. Ellis's poisoning, Mr. Clarence's shooting, guests remained, confined by Inspector Craddock's orders until the killer was found. To ease the strain, Lady Beatrice announced a second party, a small gathering to restore calm. The grand hall, still aglow with chandeliers, was transformed, with fresh flowers and a new quartet, but the gaiety felt forced, like a smile on a mourner's face. Miss Jane Marple, seated near a tapestry, her embroidered handbag heavy with clues, the note, the thread, the handkerchief, the goblet. The locket watched the scene with quiet intensity. The will Mr. Clarence had confessed to disinheriting. Lady Beatrice was the key, and she sensed tonight would bring it to light. Mrs. Price, nibbling a cucumber sandwich, leaned close. "Jane, another party. After all this, it's madness." "I swear, Lady Beatrice is as cool as ice, but I saw her hands shake when she poured the tea." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Ice can crack, Agnes, given the right pressure." Her gaze drifted to Lady Beatrice, resplendent in sapphire silk, her smile tight as she greeted guests. Miss Violet, in a muted violet gown, laughed softly with a local magistrate, her charm subdued but present. Dr. Ellis, his face drawn, stood by the punch bowl, while Mr. Clarence, his arm bandaged, hovered near the quartet, his eyes darting nervously. Miss Marple had a plan. The library, where the cryptic note was found, was the heart of the mystery, and Mr. Clarence's mention of papers suggested the will might be hidden there. To move unnoticed, she needed a disguise. She approached Elsie, the maid who was clearing plates. "Elsie dear," she whispered, "might I borrow a uniform? I've a notion to help with the serving tonight." Elsie blinked, then grinned. "You're up to something, aren't you, ma'am? Come to the pantry, I've a spare apron and cap." Minutes later, Miss Marple emerged, her grey hair tucked under a starched cap, her shawl replaced by a black dress and apron. She blended seamlessly with the servants, her tray of canapes a perfect cover. Carrying her tray, she moved through the crowd, her ears attuned to snippets of conversation. Near the fireplace, she paused, catching a low exchange between Lady Beatrice and Miss Violet. The papers must be found tonight, Lady Beatrice hissed, her voice barely audible over the music. If they're in the library, we can't let her get them. Miss Violet's lips curved. Don't worry, Beatrice. I'll handle it. But if Clarence talks, we're done for. Their words confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. The will was in the library, and they knew it. She slipped into the hallway, her tray a pretext, and reached the library door. It was unlocked, a careless oversight in the evening's chaos. Inside, the room was as she'd left it, the candelabrum casting flickering shadows. She set her tray down and moved to the bookshelves, recalling the hidden compartment behind the language of flowers. Her fingers found the book, but before she could pull it, a soft creak made her freeze. She ducked behind a curtain, her heart steady but alert. Footsteps entered to set, light and purposeful. Through a gap in the curtain, Miss Marple saw Lady Beatrice and Miss Violet, their faces tense. It's here somewhere, Lady Beatrice whispered, scanning the shelves. Eleanor was clever, but not clever enough. Miss Violet's voice was sharp. If we don't find it before that nosy old woman does, we're ruined. Clarence is already cracking. They rummaged through books, their movements frantic, unaware of Miss Marple's presence. Seizing the moment, Miss Marple slipped from her hiding place and pulled the language of flowers. The panel clicked open, revealing a folded document tied with a faded ribbon. She tucked it into her apron, her hands swift, and resumed her servant's pose, just as Lady Beatrice turned. Who's there? She snapped, her eyes narrowing. Miss Marple stepped forward, holding her tray. Only a servant, m'lady, she said, her voice meek. Fresh connect. Her disguise held, and Lady Beatrice waved her away, distracted by Miss Violet's hissed warning to hurry. Back in the hall, Miss Marple retreated to a quiet alcove and examined the document. It was Eleanor Harrow's will, dated 1919, bequeathing Blackthorn Manor to Jonathan Reed, my beloved husband. Miss Marple's breath caught Mr. Reed, the murdered guest, was Eleanor's husband. The will explained his presence, his death, and Lady Beatrice's desperation to keep it hidden. She slipped it into her handbag, her mind racing. A scream pierced the air, high and sharp, from the grand hall. Miss Marple hurried back, her disguise intact, and found the guests gathered around Miss Violet, who lay crumpled on the floor, her violet gown splayed. A small glass vial rolled from her hand, its label glinting in the chandelier light. Dr. Ellis knelt beside her, checking her pulse, his face grim. She's fainted, he said, but his eyes flicked to the vial with a flicker of recognition. Miss Marple, still posing as a servant, picked up the vial with her napkin, noting the label, digitalis, the same poison used on Dr. Ellis. She handed it to Inspector Craddock, who had pushed through the crowd. Inspector, this may be important, she said, dropping her servant's tone. Craddock's eyes widened. Miss Marple, good Lord, what's with the apron? He took the vial, his expression darkening. Digitalis again. This is no coincidence. As Dr. Ellis revived Miss Violet with smelling salts, she stirred, her eyes fluttering open. It wasn't mine, she murmured, her voice weak. He made me carry it. Who? Craddock demanded. But Miss Violet's gaze locked on Miss Marple, a mix of fear and defiance in her eyes. Miss Marple knelt beside her, her voice gentle but probing. Miss Violet, you're safe now. Who gave you the vial, and why? Miss Violet's lips trembled, her charm shattered. Reed, she whispered. He knew about my past debts, a scandal in London. He blackmailed me to help him find the will. He said if I didn't, he'd ruin me. The digitalis. It was for insurance, he said, in case things went wrong. Miss Marple nodded, the pieces falling into place. And when he was killed, you kept it, fearing exposure. Miss Violet nodded, tears smudging her makeup. I didn't poison Ellis, I swear. Reed gave me the vial, but I never used it. Craddock signalled a constable to escort Miss Violet to a private room for questioning. Miss Marple stepped back, her mind turning to the will. Reed, as Eleanor's husband, had a claim to the manor, a motive for his murder. Lady Beatrice, standing nearby, watched Miss Violet's removal with a stony expression. Her hands clenched. Mrs. Price, who had been hovering, clutched Miss Marple's arm. Jane, you were a servant, and now Miss Violet with poison. This is like a penny dreadful. Miss Marple smiled faintly, shedding her apron and cap. Life, Agnes, is often more dramatic than fiction. She glanced at Lady Beatrice, whose gaze lingered on the library door. The will, now in Miss Marple's possession, was the key to the manor's secrets, and Lady Beatrice's fear suggested she knew it. Inspector Craddock approached, his notebook open. Miss Marple, you've outdone yourself a will, you say, and this file connected to Reed. She nodded, handing him the document. Eleanor Harrow's will, leaving the manor to Mr. Reed, her husband. It explains much, Inspector, though not all. Miss Violet's blackmail ties her to Reed, but the killer remains at large. Craddock scanned the will, his jaw tightening. This changes everything. Beatrice stands to lose the manor, and the digitalis Summer's playing a dangerous game. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to Dr. Ellis, who was now speaking with a constable, his medical bag at his side. The rifle from the shooting, the digitalis in his winous roll, was unclear, but the threads were tightening. For now, Miss Violet's confession was a breakthrough, revealing Reed's blackmail and her fear, a motive that illuminated the poison's presence. As the party dispersed, the guests shaken, Miss Marple lingered in the hall, her handbag heavier with the will. Lady Beatrice's sapphire gown vanished up the staircase, but her shadow loomed large. The truth, Miss Marple knew, was close, hidden in the manor's secrets and the rose's silent decay. Jane, you're a marvel, Mrs. Price said, her voice awed. What's next? Miss Marple's gaze was steady. The end, Agnes. Every secret blooms in time. Her eyes flicked to the library, where the truth had been hidden, now ready to unravel. Chapter 9. The Final Confrontation. The library of Blackthorn Manor was a haven of shadows and secrets, its bookshelves looming like silent witnesses under the flickering candelabrum. Miss Jane Marple stood at the centre, her embroidered handbag resting on the mahogany desk, its contents the cryptic note, the dark thread, Mr. Reed's handkerchief, the poisoned goblet, the locket, and Eleanor Harrow's will, a testament to the tangled web she had unravelled. The guests, summoned by Inspector Craddock, gathered in a tense semicircle. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her sapphire gown a stark contrast to her pale face. Miss Violet, her eyes haunted. Mr. Clarence, his bandaged arm trembling. Dr. Ellis, his scowl defiant. And Mrs. Price, clutching her shawl, her excitement barely contained. The air was heavy with anticipation, the weight of a murderer among them. Miss Marple's voice, soft but commanding, broke the silence. Good evening, all. This has been a party of surprises, as the advertisement promised, but none so grave as murder. Mr. Reed's death, Dr. Ellis's poisoning, Mr. Clarence's shooting all. threads in a pattern that leads us here. Lady Beatrice's lips tightened. Miss Marple, this is absurd. The police are handling it. Why this ... theatrical display? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, undeterred. Because, Lady Beatrice, the truth requires clarity, and I believe it. Lies in this room, where it began. She lifted the note from her handbag. Its words, the truth, lies where the roses fade, etched in Mr. Clarence's hand. This note, found in this library, pointed to the rose garden, where Mr. Reed was found stabbed among poisoned roses. Mr. Clarence shifted, his voice weak. I told you, Miss Marple, I wrote it for myself, to mark where I'd hidden a copy of Eleanor's will. I never meant for it to be found. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, Mr. Clarence, but someone did find it, and it led to murder. She turned to the group, her gaze steady. Let us begin with the will. She produced the document. It's faded, ribbons stark against the paper. Eleanor Harrow, Lady Beatrice's sister, left Blackthorn Manor to Jonathan Reed, her husband, in 1919. Before she vanished, Mr. Reed came here to claim his inheritance, did he not? Inspector Craddock, standing by the door, nodded. The will checks out. Reed was married to Eleanor in secret, confirmed by records we found today. Lady Beatrice's hands clenched. That's preposterous. Eleanor left no such will. She disappeared, and the manor is mine. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. Yet the locket, buried in the rose garden, bore Eleanor's initials, E.H., and a photograph of her. You recognized it, Lady Beatrice, when I mentioned it earlier. Your hands trembled, just as they did when Elsie screamed in this library. The guests murmured, their eyes on Lady Beatrice, who stood rigid. Miss Violet spoke, her voice shaky. What does this have to do with me? I told you, Reed blackmailed me over my past. I didn't kill him. Miss Marple turned to her. You were entangled, Miss Violet, but not the killer. Reed used your secrets to force your help in finding the will, and you carried digitalis, perhaps at his behest. But the vial found when you collapsed suggests fear, not guilt. She shifted to Dr. Ellis. And you, Doctor, were nearly poisoned. With your own digitalis, a warning, perhaps, to keep you silent. But about what? Dr. Ellis scowled. I've nothing to hide. That rifle was stolen from the gun room. Anyone could have used it to shoot Clarence. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Anyone with access, yes. But let us return to the garden, where the roses were poisoned with herbicide, as the soil analysis confirmed. She glanced at Craddock, who nodded. Someone wanted those roses to fade, to fulfill the note's prophecy and draw red there. Only one person had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to orchestrate this. She turned to Lady Beatrice, her voice steady. You, Lady Beatrice, knew of Eleanor's will. You learned Reed was her husband and stood to take the manor. You poisoned the roses to mark the spot, wrote the note in Clarence's hand to lure Reed, and stabbed him when he arrived. You poisoned Dr. Ellis's wine to silence his suspicions. He knew of Eleanor's marriage, didn't he? And when Clarence spoke of the will, you used the doctor's rifle to shoot him, hoping to stop the truth. Lady Beatrice's face drained of colour, her hands gripping her gown. This is outrageous. I have done nothing but host this wretched party. Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice calm but relentless. The stain on your sleeve that first night Tinky claimed, but it was herbicide, wasn't it? I saw it when you locked the library door. And the locket, buried where the roses faded, was Eleanor's. a keepsake you couldn't destroy but hid to erase her claim. You invited strangers to this party, knowing the chaos would mask your actions. The room was silent, the guests frozen. Mrs. Price gasped, "Jane, you can't mean it." Lady Beatrice, a murderer. Miss Marple's gaze held Lady Beatrice's. "Greed is a powerful motive, Lady Beatrice. You couldn't lose the manor, your status, your life, so you killed Reed, poisoned Ellis, and shot Clarence. But human nature betrays us all. Your nerves, your glances at the library, your haste to dismiss the scream they told the truth." Lady Beatrice's composure cracked, her voice a hiss. "You meddling old woman, you think you've won. Eleanor was a fool, marrying that nobody. The manor was mine, and I'd do anything to keep it." She lunged for the desk, grabbing a letter opener, but Craddock was faster, seizing her arm as a constable restrained her. The guests erupted in gasps and whispers. Miss Violet sank into a chair, her face pale. Mr. Clarence stammered, I didn't know she'd go so far." Dr. Ellis, his scowl gone, looked shaken, as if realizing how close he'd come to death. Craddock handcuffed Lady Beatrice, his voice firm. "Lady Beatrice Harrow, you're under arrest for the murder of Jonathan Reed, attempted murder of Dr. Ellis, and the shooting of Mr. Clarence." As she was led away, her sapphire gown trailing like a fallen banner, the room felt lighter. The weight of secrets lifted. Miss Marple turned to Craddock, handing him her handbag's contents. The note, the handkerchief, the goblet, the locket, the will, all here, Inspector. They tell the story, as village gossip often does. Craddock shook his head, a wry smile forming. "You've outdone yourself, Miss Marple. How do you see it all?" She smiled faintly. "People are like knitting, Inspector. A dropped stitch, a tangled thread, they always show." She glanced at Mrs. Price, who was fanning herself furiously. "Agnes, shall we have some tea? I believe the manor staff can manage it now." Mrs. Price laughed, her nerves fraying. "Tea, after this? Jane, you're a marvel. But yes, tea sounds heavenly." As the guests dispersed, the manor's grandeur seemed to dim, its secrets laid bare. Miss Marple walked to the window, gazing at the rose garden, now cordoned off by police tape. The wilted blooms stood silent, their role in the tragedy complete. She thought of Eleanor Harrow, whose love and loss had sparked this chain of greed. And death, the manor would pass to another, perhaps a distant heir, but its shadows would linger. Craddock joined her, his notebook closed. "The case is airtight, thanks to you." Beatrice confessed in the car she poisoned the roses, forged the note in Clarence's hand, and used Reed's blackmail to lure him. She drugged Violet's wine, too, to frame her if needed. A cold one, that lady. Miss Marple nodded. Cold, but human. Greed blinds us, Inspector, but it also betrays us. She picked up her knitting, the pale blue shawl nearly complete. "I'll return to St. Mary Mead tomorrow. The village will have plenty to talk about." As she and Mrs. Price left the library, the manor's doors closed behind them, sealing its secrets. The party, with its deadly announcement, was over, and Miss Marple's quiet brilliance had prevailed. Back in her cottage, she would sit by her window, her needles clicking, watching the world's patterns unfold, ready for the next puzzle life might bring.